Welcome everyone to the third webinar on business data ethics. This is the third in our 5-part webinar series on this emerging field of corporate management. My name is Dennis Hirsch, and I am the faculty director of the Program on Data and Governance, a program of the Moritz College of Law and of the Translational Data Analytics Institute at The Ohio State University. Companies use advanced analytics and AI for many beneficial purposes, but their use of these technologies can also lead to privacy invasions, harmful bias, opacity through black box decision-making, and other types of harms. As a privacy lawyer, I know that the law lags these technological advances and does not yet sufficiently protect people against these harms. Companies that seek to make their use of advanced analytics and AI fairer and more transparent accordingly say that they are going beyond the law, that they are going into the realm of ethics. And they call this type of management data ethics. 2 years ago, an Ohio State research team set out to study this emerging field of corporate data ethics management. We wanted to know what these companies were doing, why they were doing it, and whether it was effective. We hoped that this research would inform policymakers and also businesses trying to improve their own data ethics management. We recently published a report of our findings, and later in this session, we will put a link to that report in the chat. In our research, we found that corporate data ethics programs consist of 3 main components: substantive benchmarks for determining which advanced analytics and AI practices are ethical and which are not, management processes for achieving those substantive goals, and technological solutions for making AI fairer and more transparent and more accountable. Last week's webinar focused on the substantive benchmarks. Today, our panelists will talk about management approaches. On October 23rd, we will have leading technologists talk about the technological solutions. And finally, on October 29th, our last webinar of the series, top regulators and experts will discuss the future regulation of algorithms and AI. We hope that you can join us for each of these remaining events. If you missed our 2 earlier ones, the first 2 in the series, you can find the recordings at the webinar website. Before starting today's panel, I would like to take a moment to thank our platinum sponsor, Facebook, and our gold sponsor, Cover My Meds. Their support helped to make this webinar series possible. Thank you to them. I will now turn this over to my colleague, Professor Arvind Chandrashakaran from the Fisher College of Business, who will introduce and moderate today's panel. Arvind, I think you are still on mute.
Sorry, happens, sorry. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Dennis. And I'm really, it's my pleasure to actually host this particular panel, given my research on process and how do companies really manage, develop structures around management systems around data ethics. So it is my pleasure to first of all introduce and welcome the panel. We have a great set of speakers and great set of thinkers who are working in various organizations trying to develop management processes so that they can be ahead of the law and they can inform others and how to govern and how to create an organizational entity that can actually allow better decision making. So the panelists today that we have are Norberto Andrade. He is the Global Policy Lead for Digital AI and Ethics at Facebook. We have Lisa Martinelli. She is the VP and Chief Privacy and Data Ethics Officer at Highmark Health. We have Pedro Pavon. He is the Senior Counsel and Global Privacy at Salesforce. And Scott Taylor, who is the VP and Chief Privacy Officer at Merck. Welcome, everyone. So the first thing I want to lay it out, and again, I want to go to each one of you, is on the idea around management structures. So as Dennis mentioned, this particular webinar is focused on what organizations are doing in terms of developing management processes to really understand and better manage the things around data ethics. So with that being said, in our research, we actually found that there is no single silver bullet. We found that organizations have various ways and creates various different forms to actually manage data ethics and create governing practices around that. In particular, we found two different, I would say, two polar extremes. On one end, we had organizations that had systems and practices very well developed and created more formal ways of informing others and learning from that. On the other end, we had mostly loosely connected and informal structures to identify when there is an issue around data ethical behaviors and then bring it up to speed and make quick decisions. So, but we do know that these are two extremes, and there could be a variety of kinds of management processes and structures around it. So what I want to open up, the first question is, how are your organizations managing data ethics, and what has been some lessons, given that several of you are in this journey for a long time? How are things evolved over time, and what are some lessons around that? So I'll go in the order in which I introduced the panel. So I will go first with Noberto.
Thank you, Arvind, and first of all, thank you so much for having me today, and congratulations on this initiative. I'll provide a quick overview of how internally at Facebook we go about managing this type of processes. I would start by saying that I think we are kind of in the middle, or we depart actually from a formal structure, from a process that we've been developing and iterating for many years, our privacy review process, but that is incorporating some informal structures that then throughout the time will in itself consolidate into formal elements of this review. So let me paint you the picture of how things have been evolving, starting with the privacy review process. So this is a process that we've been handling and iterating for over 10 years, and it's basically the process through which we evaluate all the products and features that we are building that are coming down the pipeline. I am part of the privacy public policy team, and this is one of the core teams that is part of this process. It's a process that we call cross-functional, that it gathers elements from different teams, from the legal department, from communications, from public policy, from our privacy team, and we all together work very closely with product managers, with engineering leads to review, comment, and shape the way that we are building this product. So it's a process that starts at the very ideation phase of the product development process. So we meet with the product teams even before they start working specifically on the product, before they start coding. We have roadmap sessions through which we are exposed to their plans for the next 6 months to a year, and from that very moment we start our own discussions. So this stakeholder team that reviews these products has specific tasks, each of them. So starting with the legal team and our legal partners, what they do is to look at the privacy implications of products across the regulatory space globally. Then we have the privacy program team, which is the heart and soul of this process. They are the glue that keeps us all together. They are the team that is closest to the product managers, to the engineering workforce. They are the ones that prioritize which products and features we should be reviewing and approving. And they also are in charge of documenting the process. So they are kind of the historians of the privacy review process, because everything that we do is documented, from the discussions and the meetings that we have all the way to the final decisions that are approved. Then we have another core element is obviously the policy team, which is my team. And here we work in making sure that we are keeping in the loop and reaching out to the external stakeholders that should have a say in the way that we're building specific products and applications. So we kind of build the bridge between the engineering workforce and the external landscape of policymakers, of academics, of civil society, and we make sure that we gather their input and we communicate that back to our engineering teams, and we incorporate that input into our discussions and into our final decisions. We then have other teams, such as the communications team, that makes sure that we are developing proactive messages for key themes related to those products that we discuss also with external partners and groups of interest. We have obviously the marketing team that develops our product narrative and our messaging for our end consumers. We have technical teams such as the security team that works very closely with us to ensure that all the information that we're collecting is stored safely and that we have all the privacy safeguards in place. And obviously the product teams. These are the ones that are actually developing the products. So I'm very fortunate to be in the team that meets with them on a very regular basis. And we make sure that the decisions that we make at the end of the day are complied with by the product teams. So they build on our privacy recommendations into the product. And this is a way for us to develop and implement our privacy principles by design and right from the beginning. Another thing that I would like to mention about this process is how do we go about having legal compliance with our legal department, how we go beyond that. So one thing that I would like to stress about our process is the fact that compliance is a floor, not a ceiling. So in Facebook's privacy program, we have obviously the legal department that provides guidance on the legal baseline, and on top of that, we will add many other considerations coming from other teams. So we also explore and discuss how is thinking on a particular topic, and I'm specifically working on AI and machine learning. How is the thinking evolving around these issues in public policy circles, around transparency and explainability, around fairness, around safety? What are people's expectations around specific product experiences that we are building? How can we effectively communicate how our product works to our users? How certain approach from a product A that we reviewed can affect an approach to product B. The fact that we document our decisions enables us to create a precedent and a body of cases through which we revert back to, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time that we review a new product or application. So this process really goes beyond the assessment of legal compliance requirements and looks into policy, ethical, and societal considerations. And so one clear example that I can give you about what does that mean has been reflected in an academic article that we've published some time ago on a specific product and feature that we were discussing with the various teams. And this was and this regarded the application of AI and machine learning to our suicide prevention features. And what we did in that article was actually to reflect some of the ethical considerations and questions that we ask ourselves during that process. So, and it's an interesting article because it lays out the various trade-offs, how we identified how certain values were in tension and what was the most appropriate way for us to tackle appropriate balances within those trade-offs. We've dealt with ethical questions like starting from the very basic one of legitimacy of how we as a company should be in the business of working on suicide prevention features. Is this something that we should be doing in the first place? Is it something that aligns with our values as a company? And then working specifically on specific trade-offs that were involved in the building of this feature. For example, privacy versus efficacy. How can we build a system that is effective in preventing suicide, but at the same time that respects people's privacy and their expectations of privacy? Another important question was also human in the loop. How can we make sure that we have the right scope of human intervention, and at what point should we have humans reviewing and being part of this process? So this is just an example, just to give you a flavor to how we go beyond legal compliance requirements, and we do really engage into ethical questions and how through that process we document them, and we reach some decisions through which we will then be comfortable in deploying those systems in production. I mentioned that there are also other elements that we keep incorporating into this process, but I will stop here, and throughout the debate, I can talk a little about those elements as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Norberto. There were several important elements that I picked up, which we'll actually come back later. So I want to go back to, Lisa. Before we do that, for the attendees, you're welcome to pose your questions on the chat option, and we'll be monitoring it. We'll be passing on to the panelists at the end of this talk. So Lisa, over to you.
Sure. So I think in order to understand how we handle this, it's important to understand what we do as an organization. So Highmark Health is what we know, what is called an integrated delivery and financing system. So in healthcare, what that means is we are both a payer for services and a provider. So we have Highmark Cross Blue Shield, which is a large insurance company, and then an integrated delivery system of hospitals, physician offices, et cetera. So it's a very complex organization. So our system of handling data ethics at this point is through our data governance model, which is a formal process. Although after listening to Norberto, I can see that ours is becoming more of a hybrid because we've been doing this for several years now. So we actually have what we call upon entry approval, which requests come in and we look at precedent and we're able to move things along and actually speed up the process. So we're able to, satisfy our stakeholders. But just briefly, it is similar to what was earlier described. We have a multi-stakeholder approach. So we're a complex organization. So our governance process, of which I'm the chair, but it's composed of various different committees, begins with, if you can think of a house, the vestibule, right? That's where the requests for either uses, for ingestion, for particular innovative sources enter that process, and each initiative is vetted at a very high level to make sure what we're doing is legal, that it passes security standards, et cetera. So a few stakeholders routinely review every request, and they have about a 24-hour turnaround. So it keeps things moving at a good pace. And then we have a multi-stakeholder group of reviewers. And when I say multi-stakeholder, it's everything from marketing to the clinical arm of our business, to the innovative strategists, to the data scientists. So we have not a huge group of people, but adequately represented stakeholders, and it goes through a formal review process. And those, again, as was earlier described, they're recorded, they're documented. We can show the deliberation and the accountability for our decisions. And data ethics has recently been folded into this model. Is just this anniversary its 5th year, and data ethics entered the conversation about 3 years ago, where our principles of data ethics are now part of that review and part of that dialogue and conversation. And I can talk a little bit more about that later in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I want to go to Pedro. Then again, given we saw how Facebook, again, more on the IT side, how they're managing it, and we saw from a healthcare example, Salesforce, I would say, like it's all over. Their roles are all over, right? So Pedro, tell us more about how your organization has actually thought about this and developed structures and how they have evolved over time.
Thanks a lot, Arvind, and thanks to my co-panelists and Professor Hirsch for the presentation today. What's interesting about that question, and as I was listening to my co-panelists talk, I was thinking about one piece of your question that you posed originally, which was, how have you seen things change over time? And I'd say, when I first had a conversation about data ethics with Dennis, I'd worked at a different company. I worked at Oracle at the time, and I think a lot of our discussion surrounded the informal nature of how we incorporated ethics into our business process, right? And I think if you spoke to our colleagues not present today, they'd say, yeah, 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the idea of data ethics was around, and it was something we considered, but there really wasn't a lot of policy, procedure, or infrastructure built to incorporate business data ethics by design into a company's practices. I'm sure there were some types of companies that had that fully developed for reason A or B, but I think generally speaking, that wasn't a formal part of every company's kind of like ethos and DNA. Obviously, things have changed. I think things like Cambridge Analytica and some of the challenges that Facebook faced a few years ago really brought to light how important this is. I think Facebook's done a great job of reacting to some of the things that happened over the last couple of years. But I've seen it change quite a bit, and the biggest, most drastic changes are two of them. One is tremendous investment in this area. My company and others are willing to spend money to get this right, which wasn't always the case. And then I think the second is a lot more of a formalized structural approach, kind of like what Lisa described and what Norberto just described. Here at Salesforce, I think the company thinks of ethics, of data ethics in combination with AI, right? Like data in and of itself sitting in a server somewhere is not really something you're going to think extremely critically about until you decide how to leverage that data, right? Or whether to collect it in the first place. So I think a lot of the ethics discussions are around action. Should we collect it? And if we do collect it, how do we use it? I think those conversations within Salesforce have led to the founding of an office we have called the Office of Ethical and Humane Use. And we hired our first leader for that office last year. And that office's mandate is really to incorporate trusted, transparent principles to how we think about ethical challenges, not just in relation to data, but in general of our business. But as you mentioned, a lot of the work is around our collection and use of different data. I'm in the legal department. I think the legal department, the business, so that's going to be product, sales, and engineering org, and the Office of Ethical and Humane Use work together collectively through some agreed to processes and procedures to infuse ethics into product development, lifecycle, and business operation, organizational life cycles. And that's how we do it. A lot of that information is on the website, so I'm not gonna sit here and bog everyone down with the details of how it's run, but I think our business works with our legal team, works with our Office of AI and, of ethics, ethical and humane use, and together collectively we decide what the right thing to do is as it relates to how we govern ourselves with the use of business data.
Thank you so much, Petra. I mean, like, it's very clear it's evolving. It's very clear it started out with a loosely formed structure and it's evolving. I want to go to Scott. Again, Scott comes from an industry which is highly regulated from the beginning. I want to hear your perspective, Scott, on how data ethics is viewed at Merck and at pharmaceutical company. And given that experience you have had being in a regulated companies, a regulated industry, what are some things that are different and similar to what we've heard from the other panelists?
Sure. Thanks, Arvind. And Dennis, I really appreciate being with you guys. So back to your original question, Arvind, I'd probably put Merck, for all the reasons you just mentioned, into a little bit more of the formalized structural process or structured process. So our program's built on top of a binding standard operating procedure that we call our privacy function deployment standard. And it sets forth the procedures, the expectations, and ultimately how we validate and audit compliance with that program. But as I think about this topic that we're trying to address, there's a couple components of the program that I think are worth mentioning. So first is what we call our privacy rule book. And this is where we actually document all of our implementing standards, how people actually deploy privacy within the company. The second piece is an end-to-end technology solution that we built that our employees actually use to conduct any number of assessments related to the collection and processing of data. And the rule book, it forms the back-end knowledge base and the rules for that technology platform. What's important is the technology itself enables us to better manage all forms of assessments. And as I thought about this panel, those forms of assessment break down into kind of 4 different categories for me, and they've evolved over time. So the first one is what I think of as more traditional compliance, where we're assessing against laws and regulations. It's a bit more straightforward. The second category is risks. And that traditionally started as risks to the company, but it's evolved over time to looking at risk to the data subjects as well. The third category of assessment is really a more selfish one, and that is trying to assess the complexity of an engagement, a project or activity that somebody in the company has, and how we will apply our finite internal resources or appropriate resources to get guidance to them. And then the fourth one, which, it really has happened more recently, as the other panelists have talked about, are the ethical considerations. So there, it's a little bit different approach. We're using a risk-benefit balancing methodology, looking across a full range of stakeholders. And we've adopted the framework that the Information Accountability Foundation put forward a few years back. So these are kind of the four different types of assessments that we're doing. They all connect to one another. But what they really are is, or really represent, is what I think of as a funneling process. Mm-hmm. So when one of our employees enters the assessment tool, I think of it as a ball that's dropping down into a process. And what we're trying to do in the front end through gating questions is really to ensure that we direct that ball down into the right path, as well as scoping what the assessment and the need is. And we've determined that there really are kind of two macro paths. There's the traditional path, which is something that we've generally seen before. And then there's the other path, which is a novel path or something new, or a variant of something that's significantly different. And those novel activities and assessments are often, but not always, more complex. But what they generally have in common was mentioned already, which is they're topics where the external guidance is either unclear or has not yet been developed. And so they tend to fall into that type of a bucket. But let me come back to the rule book and the technology and why I think it's so important in the process. So we have a goal that anything that comes in that's novel is only novel one time. So if we're going to invest the time and the resources to guide and make decisions about it, we want to capture that guidance and ensure that a use case specification, the information is actually added to that rule book so that the next time it comes up, we're not really reinventing the wheel. Also to ensure that we don't have inconsistencies in the 72 countries where we operate. But as I alluded to, some assessments are harder. And certainly as you get into ethical considerations, those are harder. The rules and the processes for the pure compliance assessments, they're much more black and white. We've got the laws, we've got the regulations to guide against. But when you get into risk or certain types of risk, complexity, ethical considerations, what we've ended up using is a scoring system between a 1 and a 5, and we're constantly having to work to refine its accuracy and value. But that's where the benefit of the technology system allows us to constantly look at that and tweak it. I think we all know, if we've tried to do this, that it's harder to codify ethics and certain types of risk because we're dealing with normative behaviors versus laws and regulations. And I know for a fact Lisa could talk to us about how tough that is. But I would say this, even if the technology that you use, and I highly recommend using some type of end-to-end technology, even if it only gives us rough indicators, those rough indicators are extremely valuable. And it gets better and better with time. I also think using a technology-enabled process, it provides us with a lot of detail on the back end for documentation, reporting, but more important than anything is we have found that we're actually able to look at trends. We're actually able to isolate and investigate outliers. And then that helps us to prioritize how we validate and audit the activities to ensure that ultimately people are not just complying with the laws, but they're upholding our code of conduct related to ethics. So that's a really brief response. I don't know whether it was clear. I know it's hard to follow without seeing something in front of you or how it works, but that's how we're handling it.
Thank you so much, Scott. I think it makes a lot of sense as you talked about like compliance being, and I also like this quote from Roberto that the compliance is a floor, but not a ceiling.
Yeah, exactly.
Saying that, okay, that's easier. But then as you go higher levels, as we all talked about, you're getting into the ideas of ethical aspects, but then you still can score it, you still can measure it, and you still have to make decisions around it. So it's very nice to see all your 4 organizations are actually making some inroads in terms of documenting that, which could be hopefully informing policymakers down the line. Along those lines, my second set of discussions is we all know process matters, but we also know, like, in terms of making decisions, some of these things have to be well informed, not just at that level, but also to some extent at the C-suite level, because some of these things, if it's not done properly, it could be a nightmare for the organization. And in fact, Pedro already mentioned this new office that at Salesforce, Office of Ethical Humane Services, that is coming out. And you see very similar kind of initiatives coming all around. In fact, there is, in our research, we found that there is this emergence of chief data ethics officers who are responsible for that. And we do have one right here in our panel, Lisa. You are the chief data ethics officer at Highmark Health. Tell us more about, like, what your role at Highmark Health in terms of managing these things and how you're connected, how you're getting informed and informing the others in terms of making these decisions at Highmark. And I also want to go to the other panelists.
Sure. So I am the Chief Privacy and Data Ethics Officer, and that is one role, and it doesn't have two separate titles to it. So primarily, I'm still accountable for privacy across our enterprise footprint. So I lead the Enterprise Privacy Department, which has four key objectives, similar to what Scott described. We assess, we protect, we sustain, we respond across the organization to more of the compliance arm, right? Functions that are concerned with what we must do to be compliant, right? But because privacy, particularly in healthcare now, is becoming contextual, right? The oversight that's attributed to me is actually morphing, really, to align with the changes that we're seeing in the healthcare setting, right? So as the data ethics officer arm of what I do, I'm accountable for development, implementation of, first, our code of data ethics, which I developed and alongside my colleagues in the data science areas. I'm the chair, as I mentioned earlier, of the data governance program within which all of that is housed. And I work very closely with our data office team, who actually administers the data office program, right? So they're responsible for the administration of it, which includes that internal review that I discussed earlier. I also designed the decision-making framework that applies those data ethics principles that designed and we had published. And my data ethics arm also has me as a stakeholder in our data strategy. So we have a data strategy area that looks at data and considers what are those things that we want to do in terms of innovation, et cetera. The role is evolving, as everything is. I am an ethicist as well as a lawyer. So being able to take some of that experience and that understanding of how we go from what we can do to what we should do really is, at its core, is based upon the dialogue and discourse that we have. So I'm responsible for ensuring that those right conversations are had and folks are able to learn and understand what that means. Because when you use the word ethics to people, depending on who they are, it means a lot of different things. And and in our world, in healthcare, few industries cut as close to the core of what it means to be human as healthcare. So ethics really, not only from a data perspective, but from overall the general, should we be doing this, period, comes into the conversation, quite a bit. So it is a role that is evolving. And I know when I was first, and we could talk a little bit about this at some point, when it was first, I was approved to start introducing data ethics and formally have that title and have my area responsible for it. It was a learning curve, even for our senior leadership, because 4 years ago, it was still very nascent. And the idea of that was confusing to some. So I think part of my role was to help explain to people what data ethics is, and probably more importantly, what it isn't, right? I'm not the moral authority. We're here to help guide the decision-making and the discussion around those key principles that we value.
Thank you. I think it's very important, Lisa, as you mentioned, not what data ethics is, but also what it is not, right? I think it's important to understand that things. Other panelists, how your organizations manage this and the rise of these entities, offices, or individuals, and some lessons around that?
I think I really appreciate how Lisa pointed out the fact that, there's a difference between an ethically aligned or ethically designed approach and morality. Like they're not exactly the same, although it feels that way when you talk about it kind of loosely, right? You know, what I've seen done here well, and at my previous place, was really to focus the process of integrating ethics around mutually agreed to principles, right? And that's something that I think Salesforce has done a pretty good job of. The first challenge there, in my opinion, is, well, who is at the table to agree as to what these principles are going to be? Is it just the internal business? Is it the business and the customer? Is it the business, the customer, and the data subjects, which might be the customers of those customers, or it might be patients, right? Like in Lisa's case or in Scott's case. Like, who are the stakeholders who help decide what the principles are? Identifying those is complicated. It might include government entities if you're highly regulated. It might not. It just depends. So I think figuring out who the stakeholders are to help you decide what your principles are going to be is difficult. And the first step, once you've decided, okay, this is the group of people that are going to be involved in deciding what our principles are, then you've got to set out to figure out what they are and whether they make sense for your business and for the type of data that you use and collect. Now, I'm sure every company's got a list of principles out there, and there are probably some overlap and some differences and some similarities. And when I say every company, I mean a few. But some companies have their principles published. We do. One of the more interesting ones to me of our principles is the principle around inclusivity, right? How do we think about ethical issues as a company, and how do we do that? How do we think about it? And then how do we apply our approach in different contexts? And that could be geographical differences. Like I think it's incomplete to think that you're going to set up a framework of AI principles and that everyone's going to look at them as ideal, depending on who they are, right? Like your age can determine what your ethics are, your location can, your national origin, your gender can affect it, your whatever. And lots of things can affect how you think about ethics. There's a million studies out there by people way smarter than me that demonstrate that, you know, like Western ethical frameworks that are kind of commonplace don't apply in Eastern ethical frameworks, and vice versa, they're different. So when you decide who your stakeholders are and you agree to a set of principles, I think what is important is to maintain some flexibility and adaptability in that process to allow for input from unexpected stakeholders or new ones, and to allow your ethical approach to change if need be, right? And there are a million factors that can affect that. I know that was a really roundabout way to not answer your question, but those are that's my feedback on that.
No, I think I want to go back to this point. I think it nicely lines up for my next question that I had in mind is it doesn't matter who you have as an entity, but you need that entity to get informed. And Pedro, you mentioned about stakeholders. And I know, Roberto, you talked about this earlier about it. I'm curious to hear the panel's view. And this also goes to one of the questions from our audience already, which is who ensures that the systems and practices that you develop adhere to standards? And how do you keep those standards evolving, right? So can you talk more about, like, from your own organizations? I'll go with Roberto first, and then maybe like others can chime in on how you're managing these external stakeholders that you mentioned in getting informed, and how do you manage compliance to those decisions? Sure.
So I'll take a step back and following up on Pedro's interesting remarks. I would say that the challenge that we have is not only in defining, the ethical principles, and one of the challenges is to keep up with all the explosion of principles that we've been seeing in the last, I would say, 5 years. I think there was a recent study from ETH Zurich that tracked over 80 different initiatives on ethical principles. So there has been an emerging consensus on what these principles should be. We can see those in the OECD AI recommendation on their principles, also the European Commission through its ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI. So there starts to be an emerging consensus of what those principles are. But as Pedro mentioned, I think the really tricky part is to understand how do you actually interpret and implement them in practice? How do you actually make them resonate with the product teams? And one of the things that I've learned through my experience, and it's kind of a motto that I've used, is that ethics lives in small decisions and in small product decisions. So when it comes to actually building products, ethics might tweak or trigger a specific decision that will shape that product. And that decision might not be revolutionary, but it really has an overwhelming impact once it's deployed in production and at scale. So in order to cope with that challenge of how do we translate those ethical principles in practice, we realized that we needed to make our privacy review process that I described earlier on more robust, more comprehensive, more holistic. So we have formed new teams that are helping us with that. So I'll give just 2 quick examples. One is our responsible AI team. And this is a truly multidisciplinary team, has hired ethicists, political scientists, policy experts, alongside data scientists and engineers. And they are working hand in hand with our AI org, not exactly developing products, but developing frameworks and toolkits and ways to understand how we should be building those products. So they are creating resources that are then going to be used by those teams, and looking very closely to how we should define and apply those principles. Because there's not only the challenge of implementing that principle, but also how do you implement principles that in certain contexts might be in tension with one another. Privacy and fairness in certain contexts will actually be in tension. So how do we go about striking the right balance in those principles in the context of those products? So this team has been working on specific processes. So we are piloting an internal fairness consultation process managed by employees that are experts on fairness, and are helping product teams understand the fairness issues and implications of their products. And one of the main challenges is what definition of fairness we should be using. And probably this will be a multiple answer, because depending on the product and the context, we should probably go with different definitions of fairness. We have built also a technical tool called the Fairness Flow, allows engineers to access a self-service tool to understand how representative the data training sets are and how do they perform across different subgroups. The other example of another team that we form is the Responsible Innovation Team. And this team goes beyond AI and looks holistically and works very closely with many other teams at Facebook, like Messenger, WhatsApp, Instagram, Oculus, to help anticipate and mitigate harms through specific product development processes and tools. And again, this is a team that is not building products, is building frameworks, is building foresight workshops, is building ways to communicate with external stakeholders, with impacted communities, to understand how we should iterate and improve our product development processes. So to answer your question, I think it is truly key to have the buy-in from senior leadership. These teams are reporting directly to senior leadership. The Responsible Innovation Team reports directly to our CTO, to give you an example. And it's important for them not only be aware and committed to these processes, but also to lead by example, so that employees at Facebook and in other companies can see that this is coming from leadership, and this is something that is highly invested and committed at the highest level of the company.
Thanks, Roberto. The way you mentioned about how it's directly reported to the C-suite, so that again, not only they get informed, but they can actually like institutionalize some of these practices. So as we think about some of these decision making, one question that we get from the audience, and I want to direct this question to you, Scott, is you had earlier mentioned about like Merck having to build its own data ethics decision tool. The question that the audience was asking was, again, did it build it by itself, or was it informed by other things outside, or how did you go about building this decision tool?
Sure. So, if you think about the back end of any type of decision tool or assessment tool, you've got to have codified a set of rules or parameters that you're going to judge against. So, it's a simple process with a rules engine sitting in the middle of what are the right questions to ask, and then what is the guidance that you provide back. And so it's something that we built over time, but you can't get to the tool other than just having a simple web-based questionnaire unless you've got those rules in the back end. And that's a fairly complex undertaking, but one that I think is well worth it over time. So that is really critical. As I think about the panelists, I'm probably the one representing the older traditional company, that existed long before cars existed, for example, let alone any other technology. And yet I'm in an industry that since World War II, ethics has been pretty much front and center, as Lisa knows. And so, I wanted to respond also to the fact that as we move into data ethics, the way that it is happening for Lisa or for Noberto or Pedro, we're all such different companies, and there's no one size fits all of how we ultimately get there. Structurally, we've made conscious decisions that privacy and data ethics is reporting into our head of ethics and compliance, who reports to our CEO. And we handle it in a bit of a different way. I don't know whether we could just leapfrog into a position like Lisa's, because there are so many traditional organizations. If you think about the folks that head data for our clinical trials and our real world data organization, that has existed for some time. How ethics review boards fit into clinical trials. These are things we're used to that other industries haven't even touched until more recently. And so I think that we have to be flexible about how we achieve it. We're doing it more through integrated governance, Arvind, as opposed to, putting one head, because I'm not sure that yet it would be successful to have a leader of data ethics. At best, they're simply going to be governing a group of people who have a play within that space. So, our approach, and I'm sure it will evolve as we learn over time, is to make sure that the right people have a seat at the table and that we're making collective decisions together. Other organizations that are kind of post-internet or newer organizations might be able to leapfrog a little bit easier than some of the traditional companies that have been around and have very specific ways that ethics plays into decision making. So.
And that is very much appreciated, Scott. As you said, there is no single silver bullet because of the nature of your industry, nature of the organization. But it's very clear from what I'm hearing from the panelists that irrespective of having one entity or multiple entities, the senior leadership have to buy in. And not only just buy in, but support it and sponsor it and inform on that. So I think that is very clear from your discussions that is already happening in all of your organizations, which is very critical to actually make the next step. So I know we have a few minutes in line, and I'm actually, by the way, integrating some of the questions that I'm getting from the audience. So don't worry about that. And Dennis is feeding me all those questions, and I'm doing it. I want to also attack this important question because this could be very useful for our listeners out there, is the idea on how do you train people? So now you're learning. So this is an interesting problem that we have because everything around data ethics is evolving and we're trying to measure it, we're trying to manage it. But at the same time, you've got to train others, be it your employees or other stakeholders in organizations like Facebook. It's not just its users, it goes beyond that, right? What are some practices that you are actually doing at this point in all of your organizations to ensure that training happens? And not only just training happens, but training is not just a one season or a 1 year episode, but people are getting informed on how things are actually changing and what are some best practices around this. So I'll start with Pedro.
Well, I'm actually wearing the hoodie for one of our interesting kind of training programs, right? And Salesforce is really well known for providing a platform for education about how Salesforce products work and how to use them better and more effectively, and essentially how to become what we call a Salesforce Trailblazer, which is someone who's, kind of gone through this training process that we provide to be a more valuable and meaningful and engaged stakeholder in our ecosystem. What we've done is we've incorporated quite a bit of material related to privacy and ethics into that ecosystem. Not just as standalone trainings that people can take voluntarily or depending on the type of employee you are and your role you're required to take, but also incorporating those concepts into training that would seem unrelated, like engineering trainings and product functionality training. So one of the big things we do is we try to make sure that our training materials are relevant to the ethics conversation, and that they are updated frequently to make sure that they're valuable, meaningful, and helpful. I think the way we try to make sure that folks are actually participating in that training and that it's valuable is by making it a requirement for certain stakeholders like employees or contractors or customers that use certain services, or otherwise incentivizing folks through, you know, a badging system, scoring system, and kind of like fun, voluntary competition to get folks to be engaged. So that's, I think, generally the approach. In addition to that, as I'm sure all the other panelists will say and do, there are informal trainings internally all the time. Our legal teams and our AI ethics teams are embedded across the business. So while, you know, just participation in itself can be educational, right, in certain stakeholder meetings. And so I think integrating ourselves and the like kind of subject matter experts in the ethics discussion into the natural workflow of the company is one component. Providing meaningful training is another, and incentivizing or making that training mandatory, the formal training mandatory is the third component.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, given your industry structure, being in the healthcare entity, how do you think about training on some of these issues?
So several years ago, we began including the principles of data ethics, the motivation and inspiration behind that into our annual privacy refresher training. So members of the workforce got a little bit of a taste of that. And that's helpful even for those who are not in the data space, right? So everything from a customer service rep to, you know, a surgeon is aware of the fact that we have that tone, right? But in terms of the actual rolling up your sleeves and being part of the decision making, that occurs at the governance level, which is where the sausage is made, if you will. So they get more of an in-depth training from me and also from the other stakeholders that support governance overall. So in terms of AI training, we are looking to actually have a formal AI training and ethics program developed next year for the data scientists, for the other folks in predictive analytics, you know, and the teams that are really, you know, involved in innovation. So, and then once a year I meet with our board and give them, you know, not only the state of play in terms of privacy matters, but we do spend, you know, a portion of that time discussing how data ethics is evolving and where we see it. So that's some regular cadence.
So I know we're getting close to our 1 hour clock. So there is one interesting question that I want to first ask Scott and Roberto and others too, is how can AI systems be audited? And what are the most difficult issues you've faced in determining fairness in using AI systems from your own experience?
Well, you know, I think that for us, you know, AI comes in a slightly different form. You know, we're not as much designing the systems as we're utilizing systems designed by others. I think that's an important distinction. So the next panelist will probably be able to get into that more. I think for us, what we're really trying to measure is we're trying to measure that people are following guidance that we continue to refine and evolve. So that is in large part what we are trying to measure. We're also trying to look at trends so that we can figure out which areas that we need to anticipate for the future, which you can often see if you've got a mechanism to be able to look at that. So I think that measurement for us really comes down to how well are people actually following the guidance or ensuring that they are reaching out to get guidance that is compliant. And in line with our own values and our own decisions related to the use of advanced analytics, AI. But you know, in our industry, probably less than Pedro and Norberto, maybe even Lisa, AI is coming in very specific places into the company, as opposed to we're designing AI-based systems to be able to further add value like Norberto's organization might. So I'm not sure that answered your question, Arvind, but really what we are trying to measure is that people actually understand where to go for guidance and that the guidance they're given is actually being followed. So we're constantly auditing privacy-specific audits, which would include AI if AI is involved in a project. And in fact, anything I mentioned to you before, we're characterizing risk and complexity of the project. It's for that specific purpose. if we're going to take limited internal audit resources and apply them certain places, we want them applied to how well they have implemented against guidance related to the highest risk areas.
Okay, it did answer the question, Scott. How about you, Norberto? How do you think about what were some most difficult issues you faced in determining fairness in the use of AI?
So I think, yeah, that's a great question. I think in order to answer those big questions around AI governance topics like auditability, fairness, transparency, and explainability, I think our take is to work very closely with policymakers, with lawmakers, and other important stakeholders of society like civil society and academics. So let me give you an example of how we're doing that at Facebook. So we believe, and this is part of our strategy to actually push for proactive regulation in a number of areas. And we think that the AI is one of them where we need really to collectively think through the most appropriate and balanced type of regulation that is needed to govern this type of technology. So we as a company and many others have the expertise of building these systems. So we do have important input to contribute and shape that debate. So what we've started some time ago is what we call a policy prototyping program. And this is taking a page from regulatory sandboxes that have been very effective and successful in the fintech industry, but taking a step back. So chronologically, and given that there is, for the time being, not a holistic AI governance framework or regulation, we think that is important before we actually enact and officialize a specific regulatory or legislative approach. It would be interesting to actually experiment with different ways to better inform how that lawmaking process should be handled. So we've started this policy prototyping programs where basically we mobilize a coalition of industry partners and working closely with governments. We are co-creating specific governance frameworks on AI, and we're not trying to cover everything. So those governance frameworks are actually targeted to specific topics. So one of them is on transparency and explainability, and the other that we're doing is on AI risk assessment. So we are actually co-creating a process to identify, qualify, quantify, and mitigate risks posed by AI systems could look like. And what we do is actually, after co-creating it, we test it in practice. So through this group of industry companies, all AI companies, we test that governance framework in practice. We try to understand how useful that framework is in actually simulating those type of assessment processes, how clear it is, how useful it is, how actionable it is, so that we can derive important policy recommendations and considerations that we would then deliver to policymakers to inform the lawmaking process. So this is one way that we think the industry can contribute meaningfully to this debate, to give evidence-based and empirical information on how certain policy governance frameworks would work in practice through a safe testing ground like the ones we're developing through policy prototyping, so that lawmakers would have another data point to use when thinking about legislation and regulation in this space. So auditability could be another important topic where we could understand how that would work in practice, how auditability in a world where we need to take into account also important IP considerations, privacy considerations, depending on what you would need to disclose, how can that actually be made in practice that is respectful of people's privacy, that still continues triggering continuous innovation through our IP systems? How can that actually be made in practice? So we think that this type of prototyping of regulatory sandbox could be not the solution, but an important step towards getting an appropriate regulatory solution.
Thank you so much. I know we ran out of time already. This panel is quite amazing that it's already 1 o'clock. So in the interest of time, I really want to thank all of you. I think I like to end this by saying ethics live in small decisions. I'm just selflessly copying the thing from Roberto, I believe, who said ethics live in small decisions. So what you've done or what your organizations are doing is actually creating those small decisions And you nicely ended up saying, I'm co-creating it, I'm testing it, I'm co-creating it, I'm testing it. And that's how, like, again, standards evolve. So it's been my pleasure listening to all of you today. So thank you so much for joining us today in this webinar. I also want to remind our attendees that we do have a research report that is available through our chat box. So you would, if you're interested in, again, learning what the research team has done, start understanding these issues, this would be a good starting point to scratch that surface. So I would also like encourage the attendees to talk about that. And finally, also a plug-in for the future webinars that is coming in on technology and how it's affecting the whole idea of data ethics, as well as the regulation. So thank you so much for joining in today. Thanks again for the panelists, and have a wonderful afternoon.